Started. Hello and welcome. Before we start, I just want to give a service announcement that we will have simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish, but only for those who are here in the room. So for those of you who are joining the live stream, you will only be able to hear the floor language, which will mainly be in English, apart from Ketty here, who will be speaking in Spanish. So, welcome to our event called A Call from Indigenous Peoples, Weaving a Human Rights-Based Approach in Loss and Damage. Just 7 days ago, here at COP28, state parties agreed to operationalize a new fund to respond to loss and damage. And this is broadly seen as a major step forward. But it's important to understand that this perhaps unexpectedly early agreement came at the cost of important human rights provisions which were deleted in the final decision text. And this includes proposals to ensure a role for indigenous peoples in the governance of the fund. So this event tonight will reflect on what can be done now going forward to ensure that this fund will respect indigenous peoples and indigenous peoples' rights. So we will also hear testimonies from indigenous representatives from 4 socio-cultural regions of the world who will tell us testimonies from their communities around how they experience loss and damage as a result of the climate crisis. And to help us on this reflective journey, we have a quite unique panel of speakers. Here we have Ketty Marcelo. She's president of the National Organization of Andean and Amazonian Women of Peru, also known as ONAMIAP. Then we have Gideon Sanago, climate coordinator at Pastoralists Indigenous NGO Forum in Tanzania. And then we have I know you, Daria Iguereva, I want to get it right, of the Selkop Indigenous Peoples of Siberia, and Daria, you're also a member of the Facilitative Working Group, which is a constituted body here under the UNFCCC with equal representation between indigenous peoples and state parties. And who do we have there? We have Tunga Rai, director of the climate change program of Nepal Federation of Indigenous Nationalities, and also a member of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group at the Green Climate Fund. And then, last but not least, he will come in a little while, I'll introduce him when he comes, but it's a negotiator from Denmark who has been a member of the Transitional Committee. So, and my name is Stefan. I'm climate advisor with the International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs, IFGIA, and on behalf of the organizations that have coordinated this event, I want to thank you all for being here today. It's Asia Indigenous Peoples Pact, Center for Support of Indigenous Peoples of the North, and NEFIN ONAMIAP and IFGIA. So before we turn towards the panel, let's watch a brief 4-minute video from Nepal.
Tara lo pikire ngari ke lo kaji ki piti jadang go jere na e ya ka ji shorak tsele chu me ni kubri na yi chi kungi shorak kubri woni ga te teni chi keno teni tang mo shorak kubri chu kam din ing me ta tanan da ji hinga chini ni ma ta kam din te chu yu ka ni jakta ra ka ma chi kong dong ni chi sara e sam se ni jata wa ya ka twa ko ri ya ja ka ti he tu ke bo ke pira akara kita sama sama kita jangan urut ni lah tengah yalam malam tengah cerita kau kaji tu kan mirunya ni tu cerita macam ni anak ya jadi nah orang kan ke tu akhirnya tu kita paham macam apa dia ni kita ada orang kan ayam aman sunyi tu jangan mana
Ngomong kalau sama music terus orang yupa tu begitu na, nang batu alat deki music kalau umira ni. Tetapi ya best tu sana ada. Parago cumji kadu, te halat suara dan musinya tu, te nasa de cuma anjing musinya. Te aman neri pedro, kici pedro neri music nang rata keli. Te amalat rumula te lalu kita cong neri nari. Te lalu uru mana te kita cakap. Macam dia berada di tingkat.
Chunga. I can't see.
It's me.
Nevin supports, your organization supports communities like the one we've seen in this documentary. And indeed, loss and damage is not just about sudden natural disasters happening, it's also about slow onset events. Tell us a bit more about the loss and damage facing indigenous peoples in Nepal as a result of climate change, please.
Thank you very much. Okay, now you can hear me. Thank you very much. Just a disclaimer for everyone. This is the video documentary of CNA, a news channel of Asia. And this is just an example of one village in one mountain area. Imagine Nepal has 8 highest mountains of the world, and all the northern region of our country is all Himalayas, and some of the villages are in rain shadow, and it doesn't rain it all around the year, but it gets very heavy snowfall. It should get, but it has stopped getting snowfall. So you have seen one example of one village, but there are many more villages and many more stories of indigenous peoples. And the northern part of Nepal is all indigenous peoples, 99% of indigenous peoples. And this village name is Samjong. We are doing a case study of this village, and they have been displaced because of the water shortage and drying up of water, and now the village is dying. But what I would like to share with the audience online and also the participant here in the hall is, where is this scene in the negotiation? Where are we in the negotiation scene about all those things? We have heard a lot of side events and negotiation talking about loss and damage, which is good. But the thing very much unheard about is, what about the non-economic loss and damage of those villages like Samjong? Community breaks, relationships and cultural loss, intangible cultural heritage loss, and centuries of old heritage are left behind, has to left behind in the old villages because of climate refugee. So the thing here I would like to bring up is, where are we in the discussion? parties are talking about loss and damage. They are talking about loss and damage fund, but they are talking about those things about us, but without us. That is structural discrimination. We are not in the structure. We are not in the scene at all. We are demanding to be in the board of the Loss and Damage Fund and active observer and all that, simply because we need to be in the table when they talk about us, when they talk about our realities and villages. So, how many more minutes I have?
No, but it's fine. We'll come back to you later.
Yeah, thank you. So
but
just one sentence to conclude is indigenous peoples are connected to land in those territories in distinct ways, but those distinct aspects, non-economic aspect, intangible aspect is really, really undermined here in the negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tsonga. And I think I'm just going to jump directly over to you, Ketty. First, if you can give us some insights into how indigenous peoples in Latin America experience loss and damage as results of climate change, and also, as ONAMIA is an organization led by indigenous women and for indigenous women, which gender perspectives do you think is important to consider with regards to addressing the loss and damage experienced by indigenous peoples?
Bien, en primer lugar, agradecer la invitación. Y sí, nosotras, las mujeres y pueblos indígenas, venimos enfrentando en nuestros territorios diversas amenazas, justamente por el tema, por el modelo económico, capitalista, extractivista que se implementan en nuestros países. Enfrentamos el despojo territorial, la invasión de nuestros territorios, ¿no? Persecución a los defensores de los territorios. América Latina es la región donde más se ha asesinado hermanos, ¿no?, y hermanas por defender nuestros territorios. Las desigualdades estructurales saltan a la vista. En ese contexto, a esto le sumamos los impactos de la crisis climática que enfrentamos todos los días las mujeres indígenas, ¿no? El tema del monocultivo también está fuertemente, ¿no?, el extractivismo de nuestras comunidades. Ahora, ¿qué es lo que estamos viviendo? Justamente las plagas en los cultivos, las heladas, las sequías, ¿no?, la pérdida de las semillas de plantas medicinales, se pierde pues los animales también, ¿no? Entonces, las enfermedades que aparecen en las comunidades, pero ante todo también lo más importante que también hemos perdido y que nada puede resarcir, ni siquiera este fondo de daños y pérdidas, son nuestros lugares sagrados. Eso ya no se puede recuperar, ningún dinero va a recuperar estos lugares sagrados. También cuando se depredan bosques, también se pierde mucha sabiduría, y la pérdida de los saberes tampoco se recupera. Entonces, eso es para nosotros también importante, porque cuando hablamos de daños y pérdidas, estamos hablando de que alguien ha dañado algo y va a reparar con un dinero, pero la pérdida de nuestros lugares sagrados, esa conexión con la madre naturaleza, pues eso no se recupera. Entonces, es eso, quizás por ese lado no estamos viendo, ¿no?, cómo reparar, ¿no? Y también una de las cosas como pueblos que nosotros decimos es que no es que un apoyo filantrópico, sino vamos a apoyar y esto, sino es reparación a lo que los grandes países industrializados, a lo que el capitalismo está dañando a nuestra madre naturaleza. ¿Y cómo estamos enfrentando? Justamente enfrentamos con nuestra sabiduría, con nuestra ciencia, nuestra tecnología ancestral, ¿no? En la pandemia hemos demostrado también cómo los pueblos indígenas hemos enfrentado a la muerte. Las mujeres venimos realizando recuperación de nuestras plantas plantas medicinales, venimos recuperando los ojos de agua. Nace de nosotras el cuidado de los ojos de agua también. Y además también cuando se pierden los sembríos vamos experimentando, también buscándole esa solución a justamente estas plagas, ¿no? Adaptándonos, conocemos tanto nuestro territorio que vamos adaptándonos frente a esto, ¿no? Y preguntabas cuál es la perspectiva de las mujeres frente a los daños, ¿no? Frente a la...
But I thank you for this, Kitty. But maybe we can come back to you later, and you can we can get back to more the gender perspective when we talk a bit more about the fund. Would we do it this way? Yeah.
Sí, yeah.
Good, perfect. And so thank you so much for sharing this. And without commenting further, I just want to move on to Gideon. Gideon, droughts in East Africa seem to get worse by the year. Could you tell us as well a bit of how climate change results in loss and damage for indigenous pastoralists and hunter-gatherers where you're from? And just like the other speakers, could you also reflect a bit on the non-economic loss and damage aspects in this?
Thank you so much, Stefan. And I also want to appreciate the organizers of this important side events, IGIA and IGIA partners as well. And the establishment of the loss and damage funding mechanism is a very important mechanism to address these losses and the impact of climate change. And I must say that, register my concern that this funding mechanism came very late because we have already lost a lot of our livelihood. Our people have affected, and the droughts and floods have already, occurred in our land and in our territories. When it comes to the impact of the drought in East Africa for the pastoralist and hunter-gatherers communities in East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and other countries, we have witnessed a loss of livestock in great number. We have lost our livestock, especially in 2008, where we have lost so many livestock, and most of the pastoralists become so poor because of loss of their livestock, where they depend for their livelihood. We have also lost biodiversity, and our ecosystem also have affected. We have also seen our water sources have went dry, and climate change also imposed crisis induced by the impact of climate change. So we have seen conflict between pastoralists and other land users because of the competition over the scarce resources available in our territories. But also this also caused hunger and food insecurity to our communities, so communities cannot be able to survive and afford to get enough food for their families. But also we have seen floods. Just for your information, a couple of 2 days ago, we had a landslide which really affected the communities in a district called Hanang, where so many pastoralists have lost their livestock, but also about 188 people died because of the landslide. All these are as a result of the impact of climate change. And all this we are talking about, referring about loss and damage, but also we have seen loss of our properties. People properties have also been affected. Now, when it comes to non-economic losses, which also we have asked me, we have also seen loss of our culture, identity, but also loss of our language. So indigenous people languages also people, our young generation, most of them cannot even speak our languages, and this is because of people were scattered, families were, disintegrated because people have moved from one place to another, search for a better life or for other livelihood options. And some of the youth also migrated to town to seek for the, cheap labor work for survival. So all these have caused by the climate change impact, but also we have also seen the loss of traditional knowledge of indigenous people. So the knowledge holders who used to predict weather and to use their traditional knowledge to manage their land resources, those knowledge also are disappearing, and all this as a result of the impact of climate change. And finally, even the traditional structure, traditional governance is not really being in a proper way as we used to because of this impact of climate change. So when you talk about the loss and damage, it is such a very paramount subject to us as indigenous people. And it also poses the question of issues around the human rights-based approach. And we call for this funding mechanism to address loss and damage, to ensure that issues around human rights, access, direct access to funds should be in the a priority, should be a priority for indigenous people. And also we call for an indigenous people seat to be given in this funding mechanism to ensure that the right of indigenous people, free, prior, and informed consent have to be observed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon, and you bring up a lot of important points and messages, and also a reminder of that while we are here sitting in Dubai talking, this is happening right now these days around the world. So thanks for that reminder and bring us back to reality. Daria, you're from the north.
Yeah.
Could you tell us how indigenous peoples in the north experience loss and damage, and perhaps also, as your communities are not going to be eligible for support under this new funding agreement due to the developing dichotomy here at the UN, could you reflect a bit on how that is received back home where you're from?
Thank you so much, Stefan, and thank you so much, Evgie, and all your partners for organizing such an open and inclusiveness discussions. It's so important for indigenous peoples at such a moment. I would love to start from a bit far away to describe what indigenous peoples in Russia are. In Russia, there is a definition of indigenous peoples. To indigenous small numbered people belong people which are no more than 50,000 numbers in one nation, in one group. So I belong to people which number is only 3,500. So for us, climate change is like the last point. We are losing our people due to different dramatical changes, but climate change will be the last one. And that's why I also think that it's so unhonest to exclude some groups or some people from open and accessible financial mechanism, because only indigenous peoples know what is going on in their territories, because only they know what knowledge systems or what their languages and cultures cost. For a moment in Russia, in Siberia, there are two indigenous groups which are now urbanized, which left their territories and live in cities. So only they know what cost for them losing of traditional lands. So, and just being a bit of trying to describe a bit of the situation of this summer, like according to Rosgidromet data, this summer has taken the third place in the list of the hottest, the domestic meteorological chronics kept since 891. And the hottest summers was in Russia, North Africa, and Canada. And in all territories where climate change is, there are indigenous groups. And they first of all, they first see what climate change in reality is. We have hurricanes, we have tropical rains, we have forest fires, we lose cultures, knowledge systems. We are like others. We don't benefit from climate change. It's impossible to take benefit from climate change or to have another way or another infrastructure. And I have also a feeling that indigenous peoples are all over the world is a global community. And it's impossible to divide them due to financial mechanism. Like some people are dividing by borders between US and Mexico, between Russia and Norway. And for example, if how Lost and Damaged Fund will divide these people? Like the financial mechanism, you suffer more than your group, like your group, your family group in another country. How they will measure the culture? How it's only indigenous peoples who can measure the loss and damage in their culture, in their systems. So I think that it's so much important that indigenous peoples should be included in open and direct access to the climate loss and damage fund mechanisms. Be experts inside of the fund. And it shouldn't be divided into developing or developed countries, because if even to take Norway, which is very well developed, indigenous peoples are also vulnerable there. They suffer from climate change more than other population in Norway. Or in Russia, it's the same situation. Indigenous peoples don't live in cities, in big, beautiful cities like Dubai. They have bad infrastructure, they still don't have internet, and why we should measure that their internet access is more or stable than others? It's not true. It's not true for all over the world. So I really think that financial mechanisms should be provided to all indigenous groups in an open and accessible manner, that indigenous experts should be included in the process and understand about what is talking about. Because if a loss and damage fund will provide just source need or like extra support, like you lose your house, you have a new one, it's not about loss and damage. We lose more than houses. We lose our people in this struggle. So it's impossible for someone to measure our losses. That's why I think it's important for all groups of indigenous peoples of the world to be included and not divided by finance.
Thank you so much. We have now heard from 4 different socio-cultural regions of the world, and some of the messages are indeed the same, and the situations are in many ways similar to one another. I think at this point I'd like to invite Jens to join the panel. Before we move on, Jens Fugl is part of the Danish delegation. He is a negotiator on loss and damage, and has also been member of the transitional committee, which has spent most of 2023 to together agree or come up with the text which was agreed and adopted now on the 30th of November. So welcome to you as well, Jens. And I think at this point we should then move on to focus a bit more on our attention on this new finance mechanism, and also the text behind the operationalization of the fund. So perhaps, Jens, if I could start with you. in the transitional committee, Denmark supported a call for a dedicated seat for Indigenous peoples on the board of the new fund. And Denmark has indeed a history of supporting the rights of Indigenous peoples in multilateral processes. What is your analysis of what happened during the final meetings of the transitional committee, and which led to the decision on the 30th of November?
Is it on? Yeah, so first of all, good evening to everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in this discussion, and great apologies for being a bit late. I spent about 45 minutes trying to find this room, walking around this area, so yeah, apologies for that. I think, as Stefan was saying, I have been sort of a member of this committee where that has worked on operationalizing this new fund for responding to loss and damage, where Denmark has shared a seat together with the Netherlands, and as you all know now, we have sort of decided that this fund is now active and operational, and also there has been pledged funds to the resources to the fund. So basically the next step now will be to operationalize the fund. On this thing about the seat on the board for Indigenous people, I don't know exactly. I cannot explain sort of who wanted it and who didn't want it, because I simply don't know. But I can say that at least from our seat, from the Danish-Netherlands seat, we supported that sort of as part of the board of this fund. We would have liked to see a member representing Indigenous peoples, because we thought it would be an important voice to have in the board, exactly because, as I only heard the last of the introductions, but exactly because Indigenous peoples are some of those that are really in the front line of living the impacts of climate change, and are those that having to deal with sort of the consequences of climate change, and also sort of the most perhaps difficult parts of climate change, when they lead to sort of losses and damages that the populations and communities hit will have to respond to. So we would have liked to see that, but yeah, that is not the case now. But I think in the process that we will start now, and we don't even know if we are going to be part of that process, but I think the next step will now be that the new board will be established, and the board will have to sort of establish procedures and guidelines and so on for how to work. And I think, at least from our perspective, and that's something we will work very hard for, is that we'll find some way to find sort of meaningful involvement of Indigenous peoples and other sort of non-state stakeholders, including sort of civil society representatives, in the processes leading to both defining policies and procedures for the fund, but also sort of in the processes leading to that the fund start to sort of approve projects and disbursements to recipients, because we think it's important that those voices are part of the process to define policies, procedures, and at the end also define sort of projects and disbursements, and also sort of part that they have a say in the decision-making process. So I think from that perspective, the experience that many of you already have from working with other existing funds and funding arrangements, I think will be very important. It will be important to try to collect those experiences and then try to feed them into the process through the board members and through sort of I'm sure those observers that will be part of the work will sort of, in a sense, fully going from now we have decided that we want to operationalize this fund, but there's still quite a lot of steps, practical steps to take, and sort of that feed that experience into this process to ensure that we create a good and I think strong framework for meaningful non-state stakeholder participation, including for indigenous peoples. Then just one thing I wanted to mention from what I heard from the last speaker. I mean, the fund has been created under the UNFCCC, and it's a fund for developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to climate change. I mean, that has been sort of the mandate from the beginning, and that unfortunately also means that there are some countries that will not be eligible for sort of, if even indigenous groups happen to be in countries that are not eligible countries, then I don't think the fund will be available for those groups, unfortunately. So that's part of the way it has been constructed. Yeah, I'll stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jens, for those insights, and also for standing up for indigenous people's advocacy in the process here. And we may come back to you in a little while, but you gave a good segue into to maybe what I will ask Tunga to reflect a bit on. Because Tunga, you're a member of the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group at the Green Climate Fund, and indeed you have followed the Green Climate Fund for many years, and I think it could be timely to maybe reflect on which learnings do you think can be brought to the new fund with regards to ensuring, as a minimum, a say for Indigenous peoples in decision making, and also ensuring that they are granted access to funding through this new mechanism.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you, Johannes, for your reflection. I believe I pronounced your name correctly. Otherwise, I apologize. Of course, there is a great benefit of bringing experiences from other funds, for example, from the GCF, as you rightly mentioned. And moving forward, I think one of the very concrete next step would be how you include indigenous peoples in developing governing instruments, investment criteria, meaning that where the loss and damage fund go, and also the impact areas or strategic areas, right? So this is something with the policy, and in terms of process, there are a couple of spaces where indigenous people can engage, because I was saying that COP is making decisions about loss and damage, but it has not touched upon non-economic loss and damage, which is more related with indigenous peoples in this regard. COP is talking about indigenous peoples, but without indigenous people, in absence of indigenous peoples. This is a structural discrimination. So how we can avoid this structural discrimination is being a member in the board member is one way. And there are several ways. And second is also the giving specific dedicated seats to indigenous peoples at active observer. But active observer and board member have different roles and mandates. Aside from that, I suppose there should be some experts group or independent experts group who decides what is loss and damage and what is other thing. So I think in every, for example, in the GCF, they have that independent technical advisory groups, which are independent from the secretariat, independent from the board. So they are independent evaluators or experts. So in such an expert group, we really need experts who has knowledge about non-economic loss, who has experts about intangible loss of the human society, not only of indigenous peoples, that loss forever, that's really intangible, but this is invaluable loss. So in the board, in the active observer, because in the GCF we don't have, we are not recognized indigenous peoples as active observer. We are part of overall civil society, but UNFCCC clearly recognize indigenous peoples as one of the 9 major groups. So this is where we need correction from the GCF. And another is in technical expert group. And of course, that doesn't mean that we should not be reaching out to communities on the ground. So the final one is how we reach out to communities on the ground who are affected, who have lost their assets. So really, there need to be a very kind of, one hand is like policy measures, and the other one is procedural, so that we address the substance. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And indeed, I think it is important to look at maybe the Green Climate Fund, not to set the bar there. The bar should be set even higher. But the Green Climate Fund did have an Indigenous Peoples policy approved in 2018, which has been implemented, and now has an Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, has an Indigenous focal point, and another, a number of provisions there. But also a lot of limitations, which I think the new fund could learn from. I think let's move to you, Daria, because I want to ask you, as a member of the Facilities Working Group here at the UNFCCC, do you see a potential advisory role for this constituted body, which has equal representation between Indigenous peoples and state parties, towards this new fund? And just before you answers, then I want to just read aloud one paragraph of the decision, which states that the board of the new fund may establish expert and technical panels to support its work and to provide inputs to the fund's activities. These panels may include representatives of relevant constituted bodies established under the Convention and the Paris Agreement.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Yes, at the Facility Working Group at LCIPP, we work with different constituent bodies, but the question is, in what role we of course can provide the expertise and any any expert work or submit papers from indigenous peoples groups. But as for me, I don't think that this work will go like indigenous peoples of Russia to finance. Like, of course, we can submit a new report that we are like vulnerable like others, but is it? I'm not quite sure that this is the way, because fund has modalities and principles, and LCIPP has also its functions, and there are no functions which describe like we will provide some funds or grants or whatever. So it's good to be involved and to have inclusiveness, because one day I believe it will be different, because world was not perfect in the beginning, and right now we are all together, different people and indigenous peoples at the UN, and firstly no one invited people for indigenous peoples for discussions. Now we can even discuss financial mechanisms, so who knows what will be. I believe in changes, so that's important. My answer.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. And the FWG is up for review next year, so maybe it is timely to look at that possible connection, and I'm sure that is being done, but we also need state parties to support that and engage in both mechanisms. So thanks for sharing this. And maybe turning back to you, Ketty, it's pivotal that a human rights-based approach is taken when it comes to this new fund, so that we ensure that the funding is not just ends with national governments, but indeed take into consideration the intersections between indigenous people, gender, persons with disabilities, and so on, and really work for them, and not just for the governments. So how, specifically in terms of the gender perspective, do you have any specific recommendations or thoughts for the new fund?
Bien, un poco desanimada cuando escucho que no tenemos representantes, ¿no?, en esta junta transitoria y que no se está considerando la participación de representantes de pueblos indígenas en estos espacios, ¿no? Sin embargo, hay que entender, como decían, que la crisis climática afecta fuertemente a las mujeres y pueblos indígenas. Es una afectación a nuestros derechos humanos porque tiene que ver con la alimentación, con nuestra salud, ¿no?, con nuestros medios y modos de vida, que impacta fuertemente, y que estos fondos no lleguen, eso es un tema de reparación, sería fatal, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que los fondos deben tener primero, debe ir enfocado a fortalecer a las organizaciones, no debilitar ni dividir. Hay que tener en cuenta eso, ¿no? Debería fortalecer y no mercantilizar también lo que tenemos en nuestros territorios. Y hemos visto con el Fondo Verde, por ejemplo, en la Amazonía, ven como a las hojas lo están viendo como dólares colgados ahí, y entonces desconecta de nuestra madre naturaleza lo que tenemos, ¿no? Y otra de las cosas también es considerar el tema de las pérdidas no económicas, lo intangible, lo que yo decía, los lugares sagrados, ¿no? Eso, ¿cómo se repara ese daño cuando perdemos y le hablamos a un apu, a los lugares sagrados de nuestros territorios, y que por el impacto del cambio climático se ha perdido? Entonces, considerar eso desde ese lado, también considerar los derechos humanos, los derechos de las mujeres y pueblos indígenas, pero ser visto como un sujeto colectivo, ¿no?, como sujetos de derecho dentro de nuestros territorios, ¿no? Muchos nos ven como objeto de estudio, no nos ven como seres humanos, sujetos y sujetas de derecho. Y otra de las cosas también es que mirar el enfoque integral. Nuestros ancestros y ancestras miraban los territorios de enfoque integral. El Fondo Verde solamente iba para la Amazonía, no consideraba los glaciares, no consideraba los bosques andinos, ¿no? Ahí también es recomendar también ahí a los donantes, ¿no? Y el otro también es considerar la sabiduría, la ciencia, la tecnología ancestral, nuestros saberes ancestrales como pueblos debería considerarse. Y también en los procesos, por ejemplo, del Fondo Verde, las mujeres estábamos negadas a recibir, ¿no?, a acceder a estos fondos. Entonces debería haber el fondo también específicamente para las mujeres indígenas. Y ahora hay un tema que se queda, los fondos, la mayoría en la cooperación o en los estados se va quedando un 60%, la mayoría se va en grandes consultorías y no llega nada, un poquito. Nosotros somos como los peoncitos trabajando en las comunidades por un proyectito. Entonces, eso también es una manera colonial, ¿no? Yo creo que se debería ahí también juntos y juntas construir los proyectos, ¿no? Y tener el consentimiento previo, libre e informado es muy importante también para poder implementar estos fondos. Y otro también es respetar la libre determinación de los pueblos, los medios y modos de vida. Entonces, esto para nosotros los pueblos indígenas es muy importante, y considerando que las pérdidas intangibles no se pueden recuperar o lleva un largo proceso, y que lo más importante y el reto más importante que tiene el acceso, ¿no?, los fondos que llegan a las comunidades es que no nos desconecte con nuestra madre naturaleza, al contrario, que nos fortalezca, ¿no? Y nuevamente digo que se respeten nuestros medios y modos de vida.
Thank you so much, Ketty. And you're bringing up a lot of important messages there, also around the sources of this funding and what can count as funding. And you talk about carbon markets and the likes, you know. So I think, and I know there are a lot of uncertainties still, and issues that are yet to be decided with regards to funding for loss and damage in general. And there, I do think it's extremely important to bear in mind all these important messages. Finally, Gideon, I also want you to get a chance to comment on this and give some recommendations to Jens and other state parties who actually are part of the decision making in this. You know, you again, you're from perhaps one of the regions most affected, and your people are amongst the most affected by climate change. So any specific recommendations to this fund?
Yeah, thank you again, Stefan. While we appreciate the decision to operationalizing this loss and damage financial mechanism, but we need to see these fundings channeled down to touch the lives of the people. Because as we have already mentioned, people have, you know, already affected in a way that their livelihood has, you know, you cannot tell. As we speak right away, our people are suffering, you know, because of the landslide. And therefore, there is a need to, you know, do a very quick decision to operationalize this funding. I know the basket has not yet have funds, just a pledge, but we need the parties to work a talk in terms of making sure that they, you know, they fulfill their promises to ensure that the fund mechanism has enough fundings to address the impacts of the communities in the ground. But also, this funding actually are being channeled. I'm taking an example from the Green Climate Fund. The one who receiving these funds are the accredited entities. Mm-hmm. So they have to make a simplified procedure to ensure that indigenous organizations and communities access this funding directly, instead of using even the procedure under the Green Climate Fund. I commend that we should not go into that direction. Yes, indeed, we have the Indigenous People policy with the Green Climate Fund, but that's not enough, because we have experience from our respective countries that the accredited entities under the Green Climate Fund are always ticking box that they have complied on Indigenous People policy. But in reality, to what extent the Indigenous People policy of the GCFs takes into account, to hold accounts, the government, their direct accredited entities, to ensure that the right of indigenous people are, you know, taken into account while implementing the Green Climate Fund policy. So I don't think that the GCF is a good best practices while we are trying to make sure that the loss and damage fund being implemented. So I call upon the parties to ensure that free, prior, and informed consent are in the heart of this financial mechanism. And number two, I call upon again parties and those who will be receiving this funding to ensure that they respect the right of indigenous people and avoid do harm. They have to do good. And finally, we call again upon and reiterate, indigenous people must have a seat in this financial mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you, Gideon, and I think with that, I will maybe turn back to you, Jens, and perhaps listening to these quite concrete recommendations, and bearing in mind the somewhat weakened decision text, what do you think that let's say friendly state parties and indigenous peoples can do now to ensure that indigenous peoples get a say in the governance of the fund and are granted access to funding?
Thank you very much for this sort of round of ideas. I think many very good ideas. I think a lot of things that I would sort of agree with. So I think, in a sense, a useful way. I mean, I have to say, I don't even know if my country, Denmark, is going to be part of this new board. I think we will probably try to be part of it, but we will see, and so it's not certain. So
it's early days.
It's early days, yes. So I think an important thing that perhaps those organizations that have organized this meeting could do is actually to start thinking about collecting some of these experiences. I think in particular, well, I mean, some of you already have experiences from other funds like the Green Climate Fund, so I think that will be very helpful to sort of have a document of some sort, a sort of a note that sort of tells us what are the good experiences, what are the bad experiences, what are the things that can be improved compared to the way it has been done under that fund. What are perhaps new things that we completely missed out on in other funds? I think I heard also. I think I heard both things that were good and bad. I think it's good also to mention those things that worked and where the Green Climate Fund has maybe even been sort of breaking some new ground, because that, I think, will, in a sense, facilitate also breaking the same ground, at least starting from that place, also with a new fund, such as having a clear policy on indigenous peoples, having some clear guidelines on and some sort of clear policies also on what those accredited agencies or sort of project proponents or so will need to do themselves to ensure involvement of indigenous peoples and other stakeholders in their respective countries or entities, ensure that that's part of it. Also ensure that we develop guidelines that sort of have sort of human rights approaches and so on in them. I think a document that, in a sense, sort of takes stock of what is already there, what worked well. So things that we should consider perhaps taking on in this new fund. Some things that could be improved. And that we could possibly do better, and I think that would be really helpful. I can sort of commit that if we become part of the further part of the process, I mean, we can be one of those that can sort of take it into the process. But I think if you prepare some sort of a document or package in some way, then others will also be able to do it. I know you have other friends sort of also among the state actors. So I think sort of among those that are really keen in a sense to see something like that happen, I think for us it would be very helpful. If you could sort of help package that for us.
Thanks so much, duly noted. And indeed, a lot of advocacy is taking place these days and will going forward on these matters. But thank you so much for that specific recommendation. Any comments on this from the panel? Chunga, yeah?
Yeah, no, just the final recommendation or ask. And another thing the countries really need to look at is what financial instrument they are thinking of to mobilize the fund, because from the Green Climate Fund, we see some projects are loans, some projects are equity, some are also the grants. So there are several financial, financial instruments, but I think in the loss and damage, we are also afraid of that. It will come as in a form of insurance, which really does not help. So we need really a kind of a deep discussion about the financial terms. Thank you.
Thanks. Gideon?
Yeah, maybe I would like to ask Johannes just a clarity as we understand that the World Bank will host, I think, the secretariat of this loss and damage. And just I'm wondering whether will the procedure and whatever conditions of the World Bank, oversee the operationalization of the fund, and if that will be guided by the procedure of the World Bank, then to what extent the indigenous people will the rights, but also direct access of this funding will be assured.
Yeah, maybe Jens, I think that's to you, and apologies for putting you on the spot on this one, but have you any insights to share about that and about that, how that arrangement is going to be?
I can only say sort of what we have discussed a lot when in the transitional committee when setting up this fund, and also what is in my understanding now in the decision text and the governing instrument that is part of the decision text. I think first of all this issue of direct access that has really been discussed a lot, and I think that is really clearly stated now in the agreed text, that the fund has to have a direct access modality, and it's a condition in a sense for the World Bank also to be able to do that. And it's something that the World Bank has confirmed that it will be able to do. So I think that's very much part of it. Then also I think this thing about the World Bank hosting the fund I think it doesn't really mean that the fund will take over procedures and so on from the bank. It's basically they're going to be established by this new board. So I think there's in a sense, it's to a certain extent starting from scratch, but I think also for it not to take too long time, perhaps it would be useful to build as much as possible on things that are already there, including some things maybe that's already there in the World Bank, but also, I mean, the Green Climate Fund, I think looking to that, there are things that work that maybe can be used again, or perhaps revised, because I think that will make things happen much faster than if we start sort of almost from scratch in developing everything. But basically it is up to this new board to develop most things from scratch. Yeah.
Thanks. Good. And I think I'm gonna, unless there are any further comments, then I am gonna now open the floor for question. If anyone has questions, Peter one has the mic. Do you have?
Thank you very much. My name is Gordon Rattray. I work for European Disability Forum. I'm not yet 100% up to speed with this topic, but it has been extremely interesting listening to all of you, to the panelists, and the discussion. I'm wondering if there is benefit in constituencies working together in advocating for the human rights-based approach towards this funding, and how far that has happened. For example, the gender constituency working together with the Indigenous Peoples constituency, and I'm also here working with persons with disabilities, and as you know, we don't have an official constituency representing persons with disabilities, but of course this would also be, the idea would be, is there strength in numbers without, of course, removing the right of Indigenous peoples to the fund to which, of course, they have the right. It's a case of working together rather than being divided. So I'm just interested in panelists' opinions on that.
Thank you so much, Gordon. Maybe Katie?
Sí. Sí, justo yo quería intervenir frente a eso. Estamos hablando que va a administrar el Banco Mundial. Y bueno, en nuestros países siempre nombran por ejemplo, en Perú es Profonampe quien maneja los fondos del clima, Fondo Verde, y siempre nos piden requisitos inalcanzables. Entonces, nosotros los pueblos indígenas y los colectivos, como decía el compañero, tenemos nuestras propias formas de organizarnos, ¿no? Entonces, yo pienso que para acceder a estos fondos se debería de respetar, ¿no? O preguntarnos cómo nosotros podríamos acceder a estos fondos, ¿no? Porque nos piden unos requisitos occidentales y que no va con nuestras formas de organización. Entonces, adecuar estos requisitos para poder acceder, porque muchas veces hay organizaciones, ¿no? Que son legítimas, pero por ciertos requisitos no pueden acceder a estos fondos. Entonces, o también colectivas, ¿no? Como el compañero, sería bueno también pensar justamente en las colectivas, los pueblos donde hay autonomía en organizarse, ¿no? Eso.
Thanks. And anyone else want to respond to Gordon's question? Daria?
Well, of course, collaboration and cooperation is always an important moment because, people, I always think that people make history and people make movement. And in each constituencies, bodies, you can always develop cooperation. As for me, I work with gender issues as well, and we did a lot, I think, for my region, even we are excluded from some activities. We did it as online and in person. We invited people like from excluded region to participate in a full and open manner in some activities organized by UN or any constituted bodies. So, of course, I think it's really very important. And because Indigenous peoples are peoples and they can be involved in gender issues, in work with people with disabilities, in any of them. So, and of course, it's important for me. So, of course, it's important.
Thank you. I recall one of the statements I believe at the COP last year where the Indigenous Peoples constituency called for support or openly supported the application by persons with disabilities to the UNFCCC to establish a formal constituency, and that solidarity between the different constituencies is there and is strong, as you also will be aware of, and we in IVGIA have been working with the Human Rights and Climate Change Working Group, which also is in a way a group across the different constituencies where we develop joint positions for calling for a human rights-based approach and intersectional considerations. So thanks again for that comment. Any other questions or comments to the panel? Yeah, first you and then Edward.
Thank you. It is just a concern and question at the same time. On that, indigenous people in Green Climate Fund have just remained with the role of an observer, but they don't have direct access to the funding. And my question is also in relation to that, will this funding remain, that we as indigenous people will remain spectators? Connected to that is that many of the loss and damages that indigenous people receive have a lot of history from the colonial time to the current governments that we really have, and they are continuing to perpetuate the loss that indigenous people are having, including through the land grab, evictions, the agreement with investors, and now carbon credit. So they are directly linked to the problems that indigenous people have. And at the same time, like when you look at the Green Climate Fund, we need to get a letter of no objection from the government, which is normally the entity that is responsible in the country to manage the funding under the Green Climate Fund. Isn't this some of the things that indigenous people have to look at? And connected to that is the question of diminishing difference between indigenous people and local community in the climate change discussion, which at the end of the day will also diminish in the process of support of indigenous people. Because as we continue to discuss the issue of indigenous people within the context of the negotiation, it looks like in many aspects of the negotiations, that difference is becoming less and less, which definitely will at the end of the day justify even the support of local community to mean the support of indigenous people. So how are we moving into that direction at the moment as indigenous people, but also how are the government looking at that aspect of the discussion at the negotiation?
Thanks, and could you just introduce yourself?
My name is Edward Porokwa, and I work with an organization called Pingos Forum, Pastoralist Indigenous NGO Forum, as an executive director. From Tanzania. From Tanzania.
Thank you so much. And I think you bring up, we'll just stick with your question for a second, because you bring up a lot of issues of importance for indigenous peoples, basically around the colonial barriers that face. And this is again why it's so important that indigenous peoples are part of these, the design from the very beginning, when we talk about establishing a new mechanism of that importance and throughout. So I thanks for your comment and questions. Anyone feel to respond on this? Tunga?
Thank you, Edward, for this point. That's why I said in the beginning, there is structural discrimination. That's what we are talking about. GCF, including the GCF board and secretariat, even if they would like to give direct access to indigenous peoples and other small communities, they have a structural barrier because one has to go through accreditation, and the criteria of accreditation is set differently. I have been saying that indigenous peoples organizations and communities have different qualification, volunteerism, collectivism, ownership, and those kind of qualifications are not counted as qualification of any organization in conventional approach. So what we are pointing out is really the structural default, structural barrier. So we have to deconstruct that because we are not accredited. We are not up to that level and standard. So, so that's why I talked about the governing instrument, investment criteria, and financial instrument, and so on. So the only way we can correct those things is like we bring experiences from other institutions and funds, but we need a space to share those experiences in the forthcoming discussions and the meetings. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? Okay, good. Let's take the next.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen, for the opportunity. No question, just I have a comment. So, yes, I'm very happy that, and thanks all speakers and panelists for your wonderful and important inputs. So this is the first time for me to attend this UNCCC. So I have learned a lot of things. So what is my comment that, yes, this is the important topic, no? This loss and damage fund is very important for indigenous people. And also this human rights approach is very important. My name is Shohel Hajong. I am working with Human Rights Program of Asia Indigenous Peoples back. So why actually this human rights approach is important? You see the vulnerability of indigenous peoples. I don't believe that without human rights approach or without indigenous rights, climate justice is possible. It is very important because indigenous peoples is the most vulnerable groups in the world. So what is their vulnerability? We have seen a video documentary from the Nepal. This is the village of Samjong, no? What is the situation of the indigenous peoples there? And if we think that a Mro village in Naikhongsori of Bandarban district of Chittagong Hill Tracts, still the indigenous peoples, they need to go to a hospital more than 2 days. So the very remote area, or you can imagine one remote village of Kalimantan of Indonesia. So this is the vulnerability of the indigenous peoples. They are living very remote area. That's why human rights approach is needed for indigenous peoples, needed for our vulnerable communities like persons with disabilities as well. So now I want to say that accessing the fund, it is also important. So we need actually the proper implementation of the fund. So how actually we can access the fund, because a lot of things happening, and we know that the contribution of indigenous peoples for our nature, our grandfather, our grandmother, they did not think that land can be sold out and land can be thing for the business purpose. But now company or many financial institutions, state and non-state actors are coming and grabbing the indigenous lands for the business purpose. This is the reality. So indigenous peoples actually, they protect their lands, nature, biodiversity, but they are affecting a lot now to climate change. That's why this fund is very important for them. So for the proper implementation, so we need information. That's why here, from this video documentary, we can realize the one indigenous village of Nepal. Like that, actually, we need data. That's why I am a focal person of Indigenous Navigator program of AIPP. This is very important to collect the data from indigenous communities, because it is a mechanism, set of tools by and for indigenous people to collect the data from the indigenous peoples to monitor the human rights, the rights of indigenous peoples. And it is now globally in more than 28 countries, this indigenous navigator activities is being implemented. It is very important, and we know that we have other mechanism, then we can collect the data. So data is important to monitor the rights of indigenous peoples. So how loss and damage fund is implementing, and who are the appropriate victims, and affecting the economic and non-economic loss and damage. So properly we need to use that. So finally I want to say that I met yesterday with Mr. Colin. He is head of climate and resilient practical actions. He said that for the indigenous peoples, they need actually direct fund. Actually for the indigenous peoples, we need direct fund, not the fund through different channel. It is very important. That's why we need to prioritize indigenous peoples for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I think very, sorry, yeah, very good points you bring up also. Thanks for that intervention. And I think it's more a comment than a question. So I think I'm just gonna quickly ask each of you for just a brief final word before we wrap up for tonight. And maybe Katie, any final remarks? And let's take the line.
¿Yo empiezo? ¿Sí? No, yo empiezo, ¿no?
Sí.
Sí. Bueno, este fondo, o sea, primero es importante que estemos aquí reunidos y reflexionando justamente porque significa un reto. Estamos poniendo como ejemplo todo el rato al Fondo Verde, ¿no? Ya hay una experiencia, mirar ha funcionado, no ha funcionado, en qué ha funcionado, en qué no. Si realmente los pueblos y mujeres indígenas nos hemos beneficiado, si nos ha fortalecido. Entonces es un camino largo, pero hay que mejorar los instrumentos, mejorar los enfoques, ¿no? Y también tener en cuenta lo que dijeron ustedes, ¿no? Que no sea como es un tema de reparación, pero lo estamos viendo también cuando te imponen un tema de colonialismo, ¿no? Una forma de colonialismo. Entonces eso también siempre hay que tener presente, que no haya este tipo de imposiciones, sino respetar la libre determinación de nuestros pueblos, ¿no? En algunos años estaremos nuevamente reunidos y conversando si en nuestros continentes ha funcionado o no ha funcionado y cómo hay que seguir caminando. Los pueblos indígenas somos resistentes. Resistimos en América Latina más de 500 años con nuestra ciencia, sabiduría, tecnología ancestral y seguiremos ahí resistiendo, ¿no? Con esa fuerza y esa sabiduría. Gracias.
Thank you so much. Gideon?
Thank you. We have experience of the past mistakes done by the climate change interventions, such as in the name of the conservation of biodiversity and protected area. Claiming that they are doing climate intervention to address the impact of climate change from our respective countries. While we have already established the loss and damage fund, we should avoid the past mistake. We should do good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dari.
Thank you so much for invitation, and thank you so much that you included all indigenous peoples from from socio-cultural regions. Of course, climate justice is important. So, and climate justice in financial mechanism is also important. So, I think that it was a good conclusion about Indigenous Peoples Fund, and maybe one day it will be opened for all indigenous peoples without any exclusions. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thanks. Tunga?
Yeah, as we share the planet, parties and everyone should open space to share everyone in decision making of loss and damage. The only way we can do this, recognizing diverse contribution and potential, is human rights based approach, recognizing different contribution and group of people in the planet. Thank you.
Thanks. Jens, any final thoughts?
No, just to thank you for the invitation. I think I've certainly sort of learned a lot from listening to sort of interventions and comments, and I think I hope we can sort of continue the dialogue about how we can sort of strengthen a human rights-based approach and sort of ensuring a real meaningful involvement of indigenous peoples through and find sort of the right policies and ways to ensure that in this new fund, but I think also sort of in general, because I think this is really cross-cutting for many other issues than just this fund. Thank you.
Thanks. And so, yeah, I want to thank the entire panel for sharing their reflections tonight. And we have indeed heard a lot of important messages and reflections. And I think it's key here is indigenous peoples' rights as peoples to self-determination. That is not only self-determination in the lands and territories, but also at international level. That right applies. And here we talk about a multilateral fund, and here indigenous peoples also have a right to self-determination and compliance with the right to free, prior, and informed consent. We have also heard a lot about non-economic loss and damage, which is irreplaceable. And so I think while there's a lot of talk about loss and damage here and finance for loss and damage, we should also remember that there is still time. There is still time for radical climate action. There is still time for phasing out all fossil fuels. There is time for change still, but it has to be fast. And there's not a day to waste here. So I think I think I'm going to leave it with this. And so again, thanks to the panel, thanks to the audience who joined us tonight, both here in the room and online. And also, last but not the least, thanks to our two interpreters that are sitting in there and doing a great service to us. And just one more thing, please remember all the other important side events that are organized by indigenous organizations here at COP28, and that can also be live streamed online. So I'm just giving you this here as an example. On Sunday, organized by five indigenous organizations. So I think with that, thanks once again, and let's leave it here. Good night.